And we are recording. All right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by philosopher Travis Timmerman, who is assistant professor of philosophy at Seton Hall University and executive committee member of the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying. He specializes in the philosophy of death, normative ethics, and applied ethics. He has been the recipient of the National Endowment of Humanities Grant and co-recipient of the Immortality Project Grant for his work in ethics and death, respectively. He is the co-editor with Michael Cholby of the new book, Exploring the Philosophy of Death and Dying, Classical and Contemporary Perspectives. Thank you for coming on the channel, Travis.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to help with the discussion, I've also invited YouTuber Daily Negativity on, who has an interest in promortalism, antinatalism, and the philosophy of death. Thanks for coming on the channel, Daily.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right. So first, I just want to congratulate you on the new book. I just got my physical copy. It took a while to get in, but yeah, I love it. It's been a fun read so far.
Thank you. That's really gratifying to hear, since it's so recently out. You're one of the first people to give a sort of reaction to it, and it's nice to see it finally done. This has been a project that's been in the making for a long time.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, how long did this take you to produce?
Well, Michael and I conceived of the idea when I was still a graduate student in Syracuse in 2016. And when we initially had proposed it, we had a sort of worse idea in mind, where we were going to do like reprints of some seminal articles from the philosophy of death, like Thomas Engel's Death, for instance. But the permission fees for the book that we wanted to edit there would have just been astronomical, and probably would have made most publishers lose money, since philosophy of death is still sort of a niche subject, unfortunately. So then we revisited the project in 2017. I want to say that's when we put the initial proposal together for Routledge, where all the works were entirely new, original pieces of scholarship, but written in a way to be very accessible for non-specialists, and that way it could be used in undergraduate courses as well, as being useful for scholars. And they approved that pretty quickly, and then I'd say late 2017 to 2020, we were working on it pretty consistently. So it was a good couple of years there.
How did you get in contact or connected with Michael?
Yeah, he put on, he started the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying. I mean, I had been aware of his work on suicide and grief before that, but I met him because he started the IAPDD in 2014 and held a conference at his institution. He was at then Cal Poly Pomona. Now he's at the University of Edinburgh. And I went to the conference, and it was just an absolutely fantastic conference, and it was a wonderful experience to be able to get together in rooms with people who specialize in the philosophy of death as well. And we just kept in touch after that through the organization. And then he invited me, he initially had the idea for that edited collection and invited me to get on board when I was at Syracuse. And then that got us chatting more and more.
Cool. What went behind the artwork of the book?
Yeah, so when you look at a lot of books on the philosophy of death, they either have a sort of like new agey picture or like classical work of art, and those are great, but I don't know, I like the aesthetics of skulls, or something a little macabre, and a philosophy of death book seemed like the perfect opportunity to do that. It would seem out of place in most other contexts. So this was the motivation for picking an artwork of that type. We wanted something that hadn't been used before. And then the boring part of the answer is, when you work with a publisher like Routledge, they have subscriptions to a variety of different programs that have like various pictures that they have the license to. So Michael and I looked through all of those to find the ones that we thought were both most aesthetically pleasing and fit the kind of theme of the book. And that one just jumped out at us.
Yeah, my bookshelf is starting to look a little bit. I'd be concerned about inviting people to my apartment sometimes.
Yeah.
Are you
Getting
familiar
some Harry
with
Potter books or something to balance out all of the
yeah. Are you familiar with Sarah Perry's book? Forgot the title. Daly, do you remember this?
Every
Oh yeah,
isn't like every cradle is a grave?
yeah. Every Cradle is a Grave. Have you heard of this book?
No, I haven't.
It's one of the one of the popular books on antinatalism and the ethics of suicide. And she used the cover photo of like artwork from Jack Kevorkian, and yeah, I have the ethics of killing. I forgot McMahon. And yeah, I just all and even David Benatar. So like my library is starting to yeah.
Yeah, his book covers are sort of tame though, even though he is the kind of like founder of antinatalism, or a modern version of it anyway.
So what has the response been like so far from, because you've said some people have already bought it for their courses, right?
Yeah, I mean, there haven't been many responses thus far since it's been out a month, but there's been a few people who've adopted it for courses on the philosophy of death this spring. And thus far, the responses have been overwhelmingly positive. Though, I mean, this is what they tell me. Maybe I should take it with a grain of salt, since they'd be less likely to tell me things that they don't like about the book than things that they do. But so far, they've had a very positive reception to it, and they suggest that their students do as well. And I'm using it in my philosophy of death class this spring. And the previous iterations of the course, it's a compilation of articles that I put together with lectures, Prezi slides that I'd go through to try to break down the arguments and help the students understand. And that was my favorite course to teach. Students had a like overwhelmingly positive reception to be able to talk about the philosophy of death in the classroom. And it's been even better this semester with this book thus far. But I'm about a month into the semester on my end, so hopefully it doesn't take a turn for the worse before May.
The supporting material that the PowerPoint stuff and the questionnaire for students, is that only available to teachers, or is it available to people that buy the book?
It's well, they try to screen off students from getting those materials in case instructors want to use the test questions to give like in-class tests. Then the students would in fact have an answer key. You just need to, there's like a special website if you purchase the book to go request the ancillary materials. And I think they might give it to people who are not students of a course. I don't know if you have to be an instructor. If you want them specifically marked, you just let me know and I'll email them to you.
Yay, thank you.
But for other people, I think you might need to you either have to be an instructor, or you at least have to be someone who's not taking a philosophy of death course using that book.
So I'm looking at courses at the two universities in Ottawa, and I don't see the philosophy of death in any of their courses or the syllabus that they have for their philosophy department. Is this like a specific thing that someone has to I don't know, bring up at a university if they want to teach it, or
yeah, I mean, different institutions probably work in different ways, so they have different requirements about what courses they can and can't teach. Some, departments don't have majors, and they are only required or only able to teach courses that fill like core requirements to let students get, check off boxes for what they need to do for their other majors. But most universities, professors can propose to teach a course either as a one-off thing or try to get it on the books if they're going to do it regularly. And then they can request to teach the philosophy of death. And it's a growing field, as is, given my limited anecdotal evidence. It seems to be a growing field. The courses seems to become increasingly popular, but it's still, I don't think most universities offer a course specifically on the philosophy of death. It's not considered like a core area of philosophy in the same way an epistemology course or a metaphysics course, an ethics course is considered a core area.
Yeah, I really like the community around the philosophy of death. I think there's some key players, and I don't know. It feels like a small like a small community,
Yeah,
and I just like how supportive everybody is of each other's work.
yeah,
It's nice to witness. Actually, some of the people that listen to my channel may be familiar with that are in the book that contributed to the book. David Benatar, uh, Thaddeus Metz. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Todd May, Frederick Kaufman. So just a few people that sort of have talked about uh, uh, procreative ethics as well, and meaning and death. And how did you pick who was going to contribute? Did you make a call out for papers or?
no, we just did invite only for this. We could have done a call for papers, but just having Michael having run the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying, he'd been able to get to know most people who work in the field pretty well. Because there'd been a few conferences at that point, and he'd started that because he was already sort of entrenched in the literature and he knew people there. So we started by topic, what we thought would be ideal for what we wanted to put in the text. And then we had a list of names of people that we wanted for each question that we wanted addressed based on the work that they had done previously that we admired. And then we'd go down the names and ask people to contribute. And most said yes. Some people said no. They already had other commitments. They're very busy, or they didn't want to revisit their work. They sort of had been working actively in literature and then stopped. And once we got enough people to say yes to cover the questions that we wanted, then we put that in the proposal and then sent it off to Routledge, and then got the approval, probably partly because of the quality philosophers that we had who had agreed to contribute before we even had a contract. Without them, they might have been more reluctant to have pursued the project.
Mm-hmm. I just have one more question, and I'll bring you in there daily. I'm not trying to ignore you, buddy. What got you involved to specialize in this particular subject, this topic?
Yeah,
As you said, it's not really like a popular topic. And in my own personal life, when I'm posting a lot about the philosophy of death, thankfully at the start people were like, Mark, you're kind of, should we be concerned? But it's been kind of life affirming for me. I find it very interesting, and I think there's a lot of implications about these different theories. But I'm curious about, like, how did you get interested, motivated into this field and to specialize in it?
yeah. Well, my answer is unfortunately going to be very boring compared to maybe other people who might say that they've had like a childhood fascination with death, or that they had like an existential crisis when they were very young and had been thinking about it for many years. Um, or if you read like Fred Feldman's book, Confrontations with the Reaper, which is one of the best books in the field, he opens it with an autobiographical account of his daughter who was terminally ill. And died very young, and the conversations that they had got him thinking about death, and naturally as a philosopher he started thinking about philosophical issues related to death. I don't have any sort of like profound reason or a significant event that happened in my life that got me thinking about this. Really, the boring answer is when I was an undergraduate at Arizona State University. They offered a cross-listed graduate course on the philosophy of death taught by one of my favorite professors, Doug Portmore. And we were reading Ben Bradley's new book, Well-Being and Death. There weren't that many cross-listed graduate courses that undergraduates could take, and it sounded interesting to me. So I just signed up for it on a whim, and I found Ben Bradley's book to be absolutely fascinating and made me think about all sorts of issues related to death that I had never even considered before. And when I was applying to graduate school that year, I applied to some places and said I wanted to do ethics and work with ethicists, and then I applied to some places and said I wanted to write on the philosophy of death for my dissertation and work with the people who did the philosophy of death there, which was sort of weird. I didn't have any I didn't have any plan for a dissertation. I just had thought, well, this class is really fun. Maybe I'll write on that. It was not a well thought out plan. But Syracuse was the one school that accepted me to their PhD program. So, and they accepted me, and I had said that I wanted to go work with Ben Bradley and work on the philosophy of death. And so that's what I did. I could have changed after a couple of years of taking classes, but over those few years, I just started reading more and more of the literature. It was small enough to be able to get a good grip on while I was doing my coursework, and that increased my interest in the field. So then I stuck with it with my dissertation, but there was a fair amount of luck involved.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you like I had a near-death experience or something like that that got me interested in the field, but no, the truth is much more boring.
Daly, do you want to go ahead and ask some of your questions?
Yeah, sure. So I think you mentioned this somewhere, but obviously death is something that concerns us all. But I think many people, sort of the ordinary common sense view, I think, is that death can be bad for the one who dies, and I think many people would just take this as kind of a given. So can you maybe explain to us what the sort of philosophical problem is here? Why is this? Why do philosophers spend time worrying about whether we can even say that death is bad or in some cases good for the one who dies?
Yeah, that's a excellent question. So I do think it's true that the sort of default assumption is not only that death is bad for the one that dies, but it's one of the like worst things that'll
Yeah.
happen to you, and that's why people fear it and have more anxiety related to death than they do to other sorts of events in their life that could be bad. So why do philosophers think death can't be bad for you or maybe good for you? Well, one sort of maybe general answer is maybe philosophers are naturally contrarians or weird, but there's some real puzzling philosophical questions that underlie our assumption that death is bad for us, or could be anyway. Now, I should say that philosophers in the field tend to assume that death refers to the permanent cessation of your existence. If after your mere bodily death you continue to exist in some form, then the question about whether that kind of death, your mere bodily death, is bad for you, seems straightforward. If you say go to hell and suffer terribly, seems like your death is bad for you. If you go to heaven and your life is very good, then it seems like pretty clear your death is all things considered good for you. There's some tricky issues about that, especially since lots of people seem to believe in an afterlife, yet nevertheless mourn death. So there's questions about whether those sorts of attitudes can be justified. But if death results in the permanent cessation of your existence, we just go out of existence forever, there's some ways that death is different from other events such that you might think it's not bad for you. So most people in the literature today are sort of modern Epicureans. It's not clear that they sort of think exactly what Epicurus or some of his followers, such as Lucretius, thought, but they're at least like roughly in the vein of Epicurus. So I'll give you two sort of arguments about why death might not be bad for us from an Epicurean perspective. So One is you might just think, uh, if death results in the permanent cessation of our existence, then there can be no time that is bad for us. It's not bad for us once we're dead because we no longer exist. In this case, we're imagining that death means you don't exist anymore. The thought is nothing can be good or bad for you when you don't exist. And certainly not bad for you while you're alive, because death hasn't happened yet, and nothing is good or bad for you before it happens. If I'm going to, say, break my leg next week, well, that will be bad for me, but it'll be bad for me next week once I'm in pain and suffering as a result of the broken leg. It's not bad for me right now before it happens. So the thought is there's no time that death could be bad for you. And if there's no time that death can be bad for you, then it's just not bad for you, full stop. That's one kind of Epicurean argument in favor of the conclusion that death isn't bad for you. Another can be referred to as the asymmetry problem. So an Epicurean named Lucretius noticed that people seem to have pretty asymmetric attitudes between their prenatal and posthumous non-existence. So they think, oh, I really dread or fear going out of existence potentially for an eternity. I mean, I do remember as a kid, that was something that concerned me. That was something that I thought about. It's not what got me interested in the philosophy of death literature, but I remember losing sleep over that thought as a kid. Going out of existence for eternity terrified me. But, thought Lucretius, all of us didn't exist for an eternity before we were born or before we came into existence. Now, maybe we didn't exist for an eternity or not exist for an eternity before we came into existence, as modern physicists will tell you now. But there was still a very long period of time once the Big Bang happened before any of us came into existence where we didn't exist. And none of us seem to lose sleep over that. None of us lament that, fear it. We don't seem to have any negative attitudes towards our non-existence before birth at all. So Lucretius thought these two types of non-existence are on a par. And since our prenatal non-existence wasn't bad for us and we shouldn't have any negative attitudes towards it, we likewise shouldn't have any negative attitudes towards our posthumous non-existence, towards not existing after we're dead. So that's another kind of argument for the claim that death can't be bad for you after you die. And the challenge for deprivationists like myself who want to say that death can be bad for you is to answer the timing problem and to explain why posthumous non-existence is either different from our prenatal non-existence, or go the other direction and say we should think both of them are bad for us and maybe lament both.
Yeah. So before we continue, I think it's also important to say that there are many things one has to sort of set aside in thinking about death itself, like, for example, the process of dying. So I should have probably asked this earlier, but when philosophers, or at least in the book, discuss death, think about death, and argue about death, what are they not talking about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, each chapter is roughly 5,000 words or a little bit under. And for any philosophical paper, you do have to narrow your thesis to talk about something that you can adequately argue for in the space provided. So most of the people in this book are talking about whether death, understood as the permanent cessation of your existence, could be bad for you. They're not talking about, as you mentioned, whether the process of dying could be bad for you. The reason for that is because the answer to that question is fairly obvious. If the process of dying involves a great deal of pain and suffering, as it unfortunately does, and if you hadn't been dying, wouldn't be suffering so much. Seems quite clearly bad for you. Even if there's some extrinsic goods, it's going to be, all things considered, bad for you in those cases. If, on the other hand, the process of dying is completely painless or even pleasurable, makes you better off than you would be otherwise, and doesn't change the amount of net good life that you have, then that would be a case where the process of dying would actually be good for you. That being noted, it's I do want to say, like, philosophers talk about this sort of thing. There's a rich literature in bioethics about what constitutes a good death. And the good death literature in bioethics is really focused on the process of dying and how that should go optimally for each individual, and how we should think about structuring institutions to try to make people whose death is imminent as good as possible. But in the sort of axiological issues in the philosophy of death that I'm interested in, we tend to focus on the event of death itself, which is going to result in at least in typical cases, the permanent cessation of your existence. Another thing that they tend to not be talking about, at least in those sorts of chapters, is whether death is bad for other people. Even if death isn't bad for the person that dies, as Epicureans think, it could still be very bad for those who are near and dear to the deceased, who miss them and suffer as a result of the person in question dying. So the chapters about whether death is bad for you focus specifically on whether death is bad for the individual who is going to go out of existence forever. Now, that noted, I mean, there's a rich literature on how death affects others as well. Michael Cholby has a chapter on grief in the book. So, I mean, there are people, even in this textbook, who are talking about how death affects other people and how it can be bad for them. But just with respect to the question about whether death is bad for the deceased, it's only focusing on the individual who's dying. It's working on the assumption that the individual goes out of existence forever, and it's not focusing on the process of dying, which concerns a time at which you do exist, and you can have a positive or negative well-being level at each of those times.
So you mentioned the deprivation view, the deprivationism, and which says basically when death is bad, it's bad because it deprives the individual of the good they would have enjoyed had they not died at that time. Is that more or less the view? And is there anything important to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, the gist of the deprivationist view, and then there's different kind of variations of it. So one view that you could have that maybe I think some people had early on, but not really now, is that the relevant things that you're deprived of is all of the possible life that you could have had your actual death not occurred. And if it's, say, metaphysically possible for all of us to have infinitely good lives, then death would be infinitely bad for everyone who dies. The standard view in the literature now, though, is that our death is good or bad for us to the extent that it deprives us of the life that we would have had our actual death not occurred. And that way you get the verdict that different people's deaths are good or bad for them to varying degrees. If, say, a 106-year-old dies of old age, their death could be bad for them according to the deprivationists, but it likely isn't going to be, in typical cases, as bad for them as, say, a 20-year-old that dies of a car crash. And the thought behind that is that the nearest possible world where the person who's over 100 dies of old age, who didn't die at the time that they did, is a world where they would have lived a little bit longer. But a person who dies in their 20s, if they hadn't, say, died in that car crash, then they would have lived for decades longer. So that's the sort of standard view now. I think that view is the correct one because it can allow us to say when it's prudent for people to die and when it's not. If the evaluation of the goodness or badness of our death is completely divorced from what would happen in the world or one of the nearest possible worlds where actual death didn't occur, then deprivationism can't give prescriptions about which choices would be prudent in various situations. But you might think that it's prudent for people who are, say, terminally ill and desire physician-assisted suicide to get that, precisely because that would be a case where their death might be good for them, because it would prevent them from living a life of, a short additional period of time that contains so much suffering that their life would be a net negative. And then it would allow deprivationists to say it wouldn't be prudent for, say, a person who's in their 20s, who, if they don't die at the time in question, would go on to live a lot of really good life on the whole, even if that life on the whole contains extended periods of non-trivial amount of suffering. Now, this gets tricky, and I don't know how much people want to go into the weeds, so I won't get
Please go into the weeds.
Go into the weeds. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So one really tricky issue in metaphysics that affects what the deprivation should say about the badness of death is how to pick out the relevant sort of possible world, which is just a way of saying like the way the world could have been but isn't. Picking out the relevant possible world turns out to be very difficult to do, and there might be no fact of the matter about what the relevant possible world is. So that's all abstract, but I'll give you an example to sort of ground the issue. So suppose a young 20-year-old gets hit by a car tragically, and they die on the way to the hospital in the ambulance. So according to the deprivationists, whether the death was bad for them depends on what their life would have been like had their actual death not occurred. So far, it seems fairly straightforward. But then we can ask, well, what do you mean if the death hadn't occurred? How are we imagining the world is different than it actually is, such that this person died at a later time? One way to imagine it is they were still hit by the car, but they survived their injuries. That's one way the world could have gone, but didn't. Another way to imagine it is that they weren't hit by the car at all. Now, you might think, so what? Either way is fine, but we're going to get different answers about how bad the person's death was, according to deprivationism. So maybe a world in which they were still hit by the car but survived their injuries is one where they lived with excruciating, debilitating pain for weeks and weeks on end, and then died from complications from those injuries, not from the car crash itself, but from complications from their injuries. And a world in which they weren't hit by a car in the first place is a world where they didn't have any injuries, and maybe in such a world they would live for many decades longer, say another 60 years of net good life. Well, then depending on which world we're imagining, one where they're still hit by the car but recover, their death might be good for them because it only deprived them a little bit of life that contained, we're just stipulating so much pain and suffering that it wasn't a net good for that period. In a world in which they weren't hit by a car in the first place is a world where the death is very, very bad for them if, as we're imagining, they would have lived another 60 years of net good life. So if there's no sort of like principled possible world to pick out to tell us what would have happened if somebody's actual death did occur, then we get what Ben Bradley calls a context-sensitive view of the badness of death. So everybody's death will be, good for them to varying degrees relative to certain possibilities, certain ways the world could have gone. Maybe bad relative to other possibilities, so other ways the world could have gone. And there might be no kind of fact of the matter about how good or bad her death is, all things considered. And if that's the case, I mean, that's sort of a surprising conclusion. I don't know if it's a welcome conclusion. I don't know if it's comforting or if people are going to find it distressing or not. But that seems to be an issue that's just going to fall out of questions about the relevant sort of metaphysics that the deprivationist is assuming for the purposes of their view. I don't know if that made sense or if I just have muddied the waters by talking about
it. No, those are really interesting points about picking out the relevant possible world for that view. I think another thing that we might also wonder is, according to deprivationism, again, when death is bad, in what way is death bad? Is it bad intrinsically? Is it bad extrinsically, comparatively? How would you characterize the badness of death?
Yeah, well, so I'm a kind of standard deprivationist. So on my view, death is only an extrinsic bad. It's only bad insofar as it deprives us of net good that we would have had our actual death not occurred. So some people think that this is sort of comforting because we tend to care less about extrinsic bads than intrinsic bads. So just assuming that we could quantify pleasure and pain for the sake of simplicity, most people would be more concerned with suffering, say, 10 units of pain rather than missing out on 10 units of goodness. Where the missing out on 10 units of goodness will be extrinsically bad because it deprives you of this positive state. But suffering 10 units of pain will be intrinsically bad. It's bad in and of itself. That's the standard view in the literature. So Epicureans think death can't be bad for you at all for primarily the reasons that I had mentioned before, the kind of timing reason and the asymmetry problem. Deprivationists, standard ones, think that it is merely extrinsically bad. It's bad insofar as it prevents you from getting additional things that are good. But some philosophers, such as Stephen Blotty, Francis Cam, and David Benatar, all want to say that death is intrinsically bad as well. It's bad in and of itself for you. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around how that could be the case. But that is a view that a lot of really smart people, people who are smarter than me and more accomplished than me, hold in the literature. And David Benatar has defended this most recently in his, I want to say 2017, I think it's the 2017 book, The Human Predicament, that was put out by Oxford University Press. And Frances Cam defends it in her earlier books on death, and then she defends it in her latest one that just came out in 2020.
Now, when you say that death on that view is extrinsically bad, does that commit us to the view that death leads to something intrinsically bad? I mean, generally, when we say that something is instrumentally bad, we mean that it leads to something that is intrinsically bad. Is the prevention of goods? Would you say that the prevention of goods is intrinsically bad?
No, I don't think the prevention of goods is intrinsically bad. I think the prevention of goods is extrinsically bad. And death, when it's bad for you, in my view, is bad because it prevents you from accruing intrinsic goods. So that's why it would be extrinsically bad. So to take a case that, say, Ben Bradley gives, imagine that someone mails me tickets to a concert that I want to go to, unbeknownst to me. And another person takes them from my mailbox and goes to the concert, and I'm none the wiser. Going to that concert would have brought me a great deal of pleasure, let's suppose, and that would have been intrinsically good. Being deprived of that pleasure, I think, is extrinsically bad. So that's what I think is true of death, but on a much larger scale, is that death, when it's bad for us, is bad for us in virtue of the fact that it prevents us from living additional life where we would have accrued intrinsic good. Now, the sort of complicating factor is you also get intrinsic bads in your life pretty much every day, even if they're comparably minor. So the good has to be weighed against the bad. So death is bad for us extrinsically, and only in cases in which it prevents us from living additional life that would be, on the whole, good for us. But the thing that's making it extrinsically bad is that we're missing out on intrinsic goods.
Mark, did you want to come in?
No, I'm enjoying this. I just have a quick question, actually. I don't know if this is relevant right now, but I'm curious about the ratio of people that you've talked to about how many people are deprivationists and how many people are Epicureans? Because I still have no idea what the landscape is like with that.
Yeah, I mean, from my viewpoint, it seems to be that I want to say the majority of people are deprivationists. Part of the answer is going to depend on some, minor semantic issue about who you want to count as a deprivationist. So, I mean, people like David Benatar think death is intrinsically bad for you, but he also thinks it's extrinsically bad in virtue of what it deprives you of, or extrinsically good in virtue of what it deprives you of as well. So, I mean, I would count, for instance, David Benatar as a deprivationist, but he also thinks that death is intrinsically bad. So he adds on to deprivationism. Or Jeff McMahon has this view called the time relative interest account, where how bad it is for you to be deprived of goods depends on the psychological connectedness between the state, the time that you're dead, and the time what your psychology would be like had you continued living. And I think of his view as a version of deprivationism, because death is determined, at least in part, by the goods of which it deprives you of, even though his view is going to be very different from, say, Ben Bradley's. So, I mean, it depends on how narrowly you want to define deprivationism. But on this sort of understanding that I have, where any view is deprivationist if the badness of your death is determined, at least in part, by the goods of which you're deprived, then I'd say the majority of people in the literature are deprivationists. If I had to guess, roughly 80, 85%. That's just a very rough, off the top of my head guess. Where maybe 10 to 15% of people in literature seem to be Epicureans who say that your death can't be bad for you.
Okay. Yeah. Daly, what do you think? I know Benatar's been very, I mean, it's in his book, but within the antinatalism community, I feel like a minority on this case. So I'm a deprivationist as well. But yeah, I feel like most people don't see it as a harm or bad. And within the secularism community, I think some of the new atheists always use that quote from Epicurus to sort of mitigate the anxiety of death. But the implication is that it's not a harm. So I feel like, depending on the circles that you're in, it just depends. And I'm curious, Daly, what do you think about the AN community?
Oh, with respect to deprivationism and
yeah.
Oh, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think one, I think if you say that if you take that Epicurean line, then you would have to say that death can't be good either. Is that correct, Travis? I mean, if one is an Epicurean, you can't say that death is bad, but death can't be good either.
Yeah, right. So Epicureans, given the kind of typical arguments that they accept, are committed to saying that not only can death not be bad for you, but it can't be good either. Now, you might think first that's going to be perhaps at odds with what a lot of antinatalists think. But there's also something tricky going on with what at least contemporary Epicureans mean when they say death can't be good or bad for you. Right. So one thing you might think is that if death can't be good or bad for you, then it makes no prudential difference to when you die. It doesn't, you can make any sort of choice, no matter how risky it is in terms of death, and none of that is going to matter to you prudentially at all. But that is what's in your interest. But no, I should say almost no contemporary Epicurean actually thinks that. Rather, they will say that you have an interest in continued life if your life would be on the whole good for you. It's just not bad for you to die. So they'll say something like Aaron Smuts will say, death isn't bad for you, but if your life would be on the whole good if you continue living, then your death would mean you get less good life. And the fact that you would get less good life gives you a prudential reason you have an interest in continuing to exist to get that good life. And conversely, if your life were to continue and it would only contain suffering and misery, then it wouldn't be good for you to kill yourself, but you'd get like less bad life on the whole, and then it could be in your prudential interest to make sure that you get less bad life on the whole. So if you're like James Bond saying you're about to be tortured by an evil villain, you should bite down on the cyanide capsule to avoid being tortured to death. But once Epicureans make moves like that, and pretty much every contemporary Epicurean says that, and every article that's in print that addresses this issue, they all say some kind of version of that. Like, death isn't bad for you, but it's like bad to you, or it results in less good, or you'll have less life on the whole that was worth living, and so on. And you should continue trying to exist and living a life when your life would be good, and you should end your life when your continued life would be on the whole bad. But once they say that, then I think they're really just saying the same thing that deprivationists are. They're just using the term harm more narrowly. But when it comes to the choices that we should make as individuals about whether to continue to exist or not, when it comes to the level of prudential concern that we have in any sort of continued life, they're saying the same thing that I'm saying. They think the same thing that I think. So at that point, I think it's a mere verbal dispute, and that people like Aaron Smuts or James Stacey Taylor and myself are just disagreeing about how to use the word harm. And I don't think that debate is particularly interesting. I don't care how we use the term harm so long as we are clear about our definition. I mean, there might be some fact of the matter about how we use it, and that's going to rely on the correct account of what gives words meanings, which I think is some form of semantic externalism. But I'm just not interested in how to best use the term harm. I'm interested in like what sorts of attitudes we should have towards death. I'm interested in what sorts of choices we can make that are in our interest and in other people's interest. And that just sort of falls out once the Epicurean concedes that we have prudential interest in living life that would be on the whole good for us, and prudential interest in ending our life if our continued life would be on the whole bad for us.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's. I mean, that seems right to me as well. Since we're on the deprivation view, so Kirsten Egerstrom has a really interesting essay in the book in which they suggest that events that happen after one's death can actually affect the extent to which one's death is bad for that individual. And so Egerstrom has this example of Tyra, who, and I'm just going to simplify the example, but suppose Tyra likes going on walks in their favorite park. So this is one of the things that gives them great enjoyment. And then we suppose Tyra dies at, I think it was age 40 from like a heart attack. And according to deprivationism, we could say that had Tyra not died at that time, Tyra would have enjoyed many extra years, let's assume, of walks in their favorite park. But then Egerstrom describes a scenario in which they call Tyra's lucky break, in which we imagine that the park is destroyed by a flood. Had nothing to do with Tyra's death, just an independent event. And then the question is, does this flood make Tyra's death less bad? In other words, does it make the death less of a deprivation, since now we cannot say that had Tyra continued to live, Tyra would be enjoying time in the park? And I think that's, to me, it was a very surprising implication, but it seems perfectly okay in that case. But then the really interesting question arises: can we deliberately act in ways to make someone's death less bad? And so, suppose I'm a friend of Tyra's and I destroy the park, or I cause it to close in an effort to make Tyra's death less bad. And the question is, would this have the same effect? And I was thinking about this, and actually, I think this is an objection that Egerstrom considers near the end, which is that it, it seems to me that in the case of Tyra's lucky break, the events which make Tyra's death less bad, they happen entirely independently of Tyra's death. And so in that case, it seems to me that the relevant counterfactual, or the relevant possible world, I guess you could say, is one in which Tyra would not have enjoyed spending time at the park, would not have had many extra years because it would have been flooded anyway. But by contrast, if we imagine intentionally destroying Tyra's favorite park in response to the death, then it seems straightforwardly almost true to say that had Tyra not died at that time, Tyra would be enjoying that park because I would not have destroyed the park had Tyra not died at that time. So this seems to me a fairly good objection that the relevant possible world, when considering the badness of an individual's particular death, it seems to me it must be something like, if so and so had not died at that time, such and such would be the case. But then any deliberate attempts to make someone's death less bad will, I think, necessarily exclude those deliberate attempts. So, I mean, is this a good objection, or is there a response to this?
Yeah, I think it's a good objection. Let me give you the response and say what I think can be said in favor of Kirsten's argument. So I love her paper. I just want to say at the beginning, this was the paper that I taught in my last class on the philosophy desk. So this Wednesday, I taught Dr. Eggesom's paper, and the students just loved it. I had them on board with deprivationism, not intentionally. I don't try to make them think anything, but we had just reviewed Neil Feight's chapter for deprivationism, and they all sort of like got on board with that. And then they thinking about this issue, they found really puzzling and interesting, and I think it actually deterred some people from accepting deprivationism, perhaps in spite of what Kirsten wanted. Okay, so your question is take two versions of the Tyra case. So one version is that Kirsten considers the park is destroyed for events that are unrelated to Tyra's death. And in those cases, we should think the nearest possible world where that event didn't occur, say the flooding of a park, the nearest possible world where Tyra continued living is one where that event still occurred, the flooding of the park. But in cases when friends of Tyra's are deliberately trying to make the world worse to make Tyra's death better for her, we should think that the nearest possible world where Tyra didn't die is a world where they didn't do those things. Because you're employing a backtracking counterfactual here. If Tyra didn't die, then her friends wouldn't want to destroy the park because they care about her well-being, so they'd want her to be able to experience the joy of walking in the park. And to use the other examples, they wouldn't try to get the author of the Jack Reacher novels to stop writing Jack Reacher novels, or they wouldn't want Twinkies to stop being sold. They'd want their friend to continue enjoying this. So I think that's right if we're thinking that the relevant sorts of counterfactuals are going to employ this kind of backtracking. And I think that is the way to go. I don't think it's going to completely resolve the issue, though, because you can construct cases where agents take actions prior to a person's death that do successfully make it the case that the nearest possible world where that person's death doesn't occur is a world where they have much more or much less goodness. So I'll try to give you an example to illustrate the same point. So imagine, this is an example that Kirsten mentions and that I had mentioned in a paper that I got published in 2016. Imagine someone named, I call Sick Susie, and she has a heart defect and she needs a heart transplant. And her friend, Naive Ned, doesn't want her to suffer a bad death. And he thinks the nearest possible world where she doesn't die of her heart defect is one where she gets a heart transplant and lives many more years of good life. And he can't secure heart for her. And he's pretty certain that she's not going to get a heart transplant, that she's just going to die. But he does think he can prevent her death from being bad for her. So he hires a counterfactual torturer that is sort of like, a Frankfurtian counterfactual intervener. So he hires someone to torture Susie if and only if she doesn't die at the time that she does. So there's not going to be any actual torturing involved. It's just someone who's sort of on standby to torture Susie for the remainder of her life, if and only if she doesn't die at the time that she does from her heart defect. Okay. Now, assuming that counterfactual torture would do what they're told, then it's just going to be true, I think, on the deprivationist view, that Susie's death now becomes good for her, because the nearest possible world where her actual death doesn't occur, the counterfactual torture is hired before she dies, is still one where she gets a heart transplant. It's still one where a donor comes in at the last minute and she survives. Right? Naive Ned just sort of like bet that she would not survive, and he bet correctly. But there's still just the smallest change that you needed in the world was for someone to die and be an organ donor whose heart could have been given to Susie. So I think it's true that Naive Ned makes Susie's death good for her rather than bad. Now, if you accept Kirsten's view, she leaves open the possibility that this sort of thing is good to do for friends, that you should make their death less bad for them. But it'd be good for them to do. She thinks there might be moral reasons to favor the well-being of existing individuals over recently deceased individuals. But it's still something that would be in the person's prudential interest. My view about such cases is that this shows that while death is extrinsically bad, we also have no reason to care about how extrinsically good or bad events are for us in themselves. We should only care about them insofar as they make a difference to our net receipt of intrinsic goods. So this is a case, I think, where Naive Ned really makes Susie's death good for her. But she shouldn't care about that at all. She shouldn't be comforted about that at all. She should only care about extrinsically bad events insofar as it actually makes a difference to how much net intrinsic good that she receives. You can imagine a converse case too. So suppose I give this case in the same paper. You have an enemy and you have a lot of money as well. And you think, you know what, I could torture them, but I want to do something really bad for them. So what I'm going to do is put in my will that they get all of my millions of dollars, if and only if they don't die at the time that they do. And once you put that in the will, I think it's plausible that the nearest possible world where their actual death didn't occur is one where they continue living and get all this money, which we'll just suppose for the sake of argument would improve their life. So now you've made their death extrinsically bad for them, or even worse than it would have otherwise been. But I don't think they should care about that at all. I don't think that should change their attitudes to death in any sort of way, because you've made it more extrinsically bad without doing anything that's going to affect the net receipt of intrinsic goods that they get. So that's the sort of lesson that I draw from those sorts of cases. I do think that in the cases that you mentioned where the event happens after a person's death and as sort of like causally downstream from the person's death, that the relevant counterfactual is a backtracking one where they weren't deprived of the good in the first place. But I do think you can give cases like I gave, like Sick Susie, that show that you can change the evaluative nature of a person's death from good to bad or bad to good. But without, I think, changing any reason that they have to care about how good or bad their death is. Is that clear? Did that answer your question, or am I missing something here?
Yes, I do want to. This probably be a weak response, but as you say, so one difference between Tyra's case, the Tyra case, and Six Susie, is that as you say, Ned hires the torturer before Susie's death, and that's a difference. And I guess one thing you could say is that the hiring of the torturer is in response to Susie's imminent death, not to Susie's death. And so, I mean, could we say in this sort of case that although we can't attribute the loss to the death itself, I mean, could we say that the Susie's imminent death deprived Susie of? I mean, I wonder if this is this close to what Jeff McMahon was saying? I mean, in terms of overall losses, I mean, is it simply a matter of shifting the loss away from Susie's death to Susie's imminent death? Or is it more, it's not quite that?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. It depends on well, the motivation depends on what naive Ned thinks in this case. And I think I could stipulate a variety of different psychologies that he has. Right? So, I mean, Susie's death is in fact imminent. But does naive Ned believe that? Well, I suggested yes in the initial version of the case, but nothing would prevent me from giving a slightly different case where he doesn't believe that her death is imminent. Maybe it's merely probable, or maybe he just, he's more concerned about making her death good if she dies than anything else. Maybe he's not very good at figuring out what's prudentially relevant. And that could still motivate him to hire the torturer. But then it could still be true that Susie dies. And I think in those cases, it would be true that the nearest possible world in which she died is not one where she didn't have the heart issue in the first place, but one where she gets a donor at the last minute. Or at least I think you could describe or fill out the details of the case such that that becomes the nearest possible world where she gets the heart transplant rather than that she doesn't have the heart defect at all. Right? You could imagine that the heart defect is genetic. So the world would have to be very different for Susie to actually exist, to maintain her identity across this possible world, and not have the heart defect in the first place. It seems like you have to change a lot more about what the world is like for her to not have the heart defect at all, and then consequently to have Ned not hire the torturer, than to just imagine that there is a donor that she gets at the last minute. So I don't think the imminent death. You're right that like the way that I described the case, that's a feature of the case, but I don't think it's a necessary feature of the case. And as far as in what I'm saying, the same as Jeff McMahon's. Yeah, I mean, our views about the badness of death are a little bit different, but with respect to whether it is ever a good idea to change what the world would be like to affect a person's death, we both think that those actions are self-defeating. I mean, I do think that you succeed in some cases in preventing someone's death from being bad for them, but I just think that you shouldn't care about how bad your death is for you in those cases. You should only care about extrinsic badness insofar as it actually affects your net receipt of intrinsic goods. And Jeff might disagree with me about that. I think he might disagree with me about that in cases where the thing that changes what the world would have been like and then changes the evaluative nature of your death is unconnected, kind of causally from your death. He might think that really should change your attitudes towards your death. But in my view, that it shouldn't at all. So, I mean, I'd have to, what he writes in the Ethics of Killing is sort of open to a little bit of interpretation about the evaluative attitudes point, not the evaluative nature of the death, but like the attitudes they should have towards death. So it's a little bit open-ended there. So I'd have to ask him exactly what he thinks about the attitudes that we should have. But I think that might be the point of disagreement between Jeff and myself.
Thank you. Sort of fascinating cases. Are there any other surprising implications of deprivations, the deprivation view that you?
Oh yeah, there's lots of surprising implications. I mean, as with any philosophical view, there's going to be, I think, extremely surprising or counterintuitive implications. And the only way to avoid any sort of surprising or counterintuitive implications is to come up with a really ad hoc view to try to get all the first order cases right. So I say that because I think, in spite of the counterintuitive implications, we should think that deprivationism is almost certainly likely to be the true view, all things considered. And that we should accept the implications and just tell us that, this is something about the way the world is that we hadn't realized before we tried to systematize our views about the evaluative nature of death. Okay, so I mean, one kind of surprising implication that's related to the sort of cases that Kirsten Egerson and Jeff McMahon consider these like counterfactual cases is ones of overdetermination. So it doesn't have to involve any sort of other agents, but if your death has two causes, each of which are sufficient to kill you, then each of those events were not bad for you. So to take a sort of contrived case, imagine someone is shot by two hitmen at the same time who are working independently. So each was going to shoot the victim, kind of no matter what the other hitman did. According to deprivationism, death by like the first bullet was not bad for the individual, because had they not been shot by that bullet, the nearest possible world is one where they were still killed by a second bullet, and vice versa. Or if you have two events that happen in succession. So this is a case that Jeff McMahon gave in his book, The Ethics of Killing. Imagine a young pedestrian steps into the road and inadvertently steps in front of a truck, and they get hit by the truck and they die. Okay. And then find out that a doctor performing an autopsy found that they had an aneurysm that was about to kill them. So had they not been hit and killed by the truck, they would have died by aneurysm, I don't know, let's say 1 week later. Then deprivationism entails that this young pedestrian's death was not very bad for them, because it only prevented them from a week of good life, death by the truck. Okay, so I think that's one implication, because deprivationism can entail that, say, like a young 20-year-old who gets hit and killed by a truck, their death is much less bad for them than, say, a 106-year-old who, if they didn't die now, would have lived 2 weeks and had 2 weeks of good life. So then deprivationism would entail, assuming each of those days would be equally good, that the 106-year-old's death was twice as bad for them as the 20-year-old's. And that runs counter to common sense. Most people think like death is less tragic if you're older and you've acquired a fair amount of good in your life, and it's more tragic if you're younger and you haven't had all these opportunities. Now, I think the maybe best way around that is to appeal to a kind of plural harm. Derek Parfit does this in Reasons and Persons. Neil Feit, I think, has done the most to develop an account of plural harm, starting with a paper just called Plural Harm. I believe it's in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. So unlike a rough account of plural harm, this isn't the fully complex, detailed account that Neil Feit gives. But like on a rough account of plural harm, you would say death by the truck was not very bad for the pedestrian, because that only prevented him from missing out on a week of good life. But the conjunction of the event that gave him the aneurysm and being hit by a truck, those two things together were very bad for the young pedestrian, because had neither of those things happened, he would have, we can stipulate, gone on to live decades more of good life. Or a hitman case, being shot by one of the bullets, not bad for the person, because had the victim not been shot by that one bullet, they would have been shot and killed by the other. But being shot by both bullets, those two events together, very bad for the victim, because had they not been shot by 2 bullets, they would have, we can stipulate, gone on to live decades more of good life. So you might think, okay, now it sounds like deprivationists are just engaging in a game of semantics here. But I don't think that's the case. I think if we should accept the plural harm account, and I think we probably should, that can tell us whether any individual death is good or bad, which itself might be, I think, is of great importance to kind of figure out what is in people's interest. But it also might suggest that there's a lot more tragedy happening in people's lives than we think. Because when we tend to think about whether events are good or bad, we tend to focus on them in isolation. But if the conjunctions of events can be good or bad for us as well, then it's probably true of lots of people that there's a conjunction of all sorts of events that deprive us of lots of really, really good life. Even if it's not as immediate or as transparent as like 2 bullets hitting us, it's probably like a series of things that each of us did or had happened to us, that had those things not happened to us, we would have lived a lot longer than we actually did, or maybe been a lot happier than we actually are. And that might just be like an unfortunate fact about the way the world is. So there might be all sorts of individual events, none of which themselves taken in isolation are harmful, but which together constitute a very, very great harm for us. The flip side, though, is more like positive upshot, though, is there's probably all sorts of plural benefits we get that we're not aware of as well. All sorts of things that happen to us, none of which individually are good, but together get us a lot of good that we wouldn't have otherwise have got. And that might not be something that we tend to think about or be cognizant of in our day-to-day life. So, plural harms can be bad for us, but plural benefits can be good for us, and this kind of plural account of events cuts both ways. One other, I think, counterintuitive implication of deprivationism is it suggests that in typical cases, the worst time for you to die is the moment that you come into existence, whenever that is. And that's because in most cases, the time at which you'd be deprived of the most good life is if you were killed the moment you came into existence. Now, that's not always true, because it might be such that, like, you can have overdetermined deaths the moment you come into existence, but if you didn't have the overdetermined death, you would have lived on for decades longer. And then if you die at 80 and you hadn't died at 80, you would have lived an extra 20 years. And you can construct cases where death is bad for you later in life rather than earlier. But typically, the time that you'd be deprived of the most life is the moment you come into existence. And a lot of people think that that is counterintuitive, to think that, like, death is worse for, say, a fetus than it is for an 18-year-old. Ben Bradley sort of discusses this in his book Well-Being and Death. Jeff McMahon is motivated to accept his time relative interest account, partly in virtue of this sort of objection. There's questions about what that suggests for the ethics of abortion. So, here's how, like, Jeff McMahon tries to solve the problem roughly, and then I'll say what I think about the issue. So Jeff McMahon thinks the badness of our death isn't determined only by the amount of good life we would have had our actual death not occurred, but it's a product of that combined with the psychological connectedness, roughly, between what we're like at the time that we die and what we would be like in our subsequent life. So the death of a fetus or a newborn baby or an infant, there's not going to be a lot of psychological connectedness between that and its potential adult self. Right? Like, I don't have the earliest memory that I have was when my sister was born, and I was almost 3 years old, but not quite. Right. So as like a baby, there's almost no connection between what I'm like now or what I think now and what, like, my baby self thought, even if there were kind of overlapping stages that led up to the point that I'm at now. But there would be a lot of psychological connectedness between, say, an 18-year-old and an 80-year-old. They would have forgotten a lot about what their life was like at 18, but in cases assuming in cases in which they're not senile, they would still remember their 18-year-old self. Their 18-year-old self would have had goals and projects that they were hopefully able to realize as adults, that sort of bound them together in a way that you don't get with newborn babies or infants or fetuses. Or if you exist before you're even conscious, then as a zygote. Right? Now, I think there's complications with the time relative interest account, and Ben Bradley gives some objections that I find compelling in the well-being and death literature. The sort of line that I want to take is that it's important to draw a distinction between the prudential value of death for the person who died and how tragic their death is, or how bad their death is from the perspective of the universe. So it might be the case, I'm not saying that it is, but it might be the case that death is potentially worse, like worse for you as a fetus pre-sentience, assuming that you exist. I don't know when you come into existence. That gets into complicated issues about identity that I don't have a settled view on. But let's say it might be the case that it's typically potentially worse for you to die as a fetus prior to achieving sentience. But nevertheless, it might be more tragic for an 18-year-old to die in typical cases. And there can be a variety of reasons for that, some of which Ben Bradley discusses in Well-Being and Death. So you might think the fact that the 18-year-old is a fully formed person with projects and goals that they've spent a lot of time working towards might affect how tragic their death is. The number of interconnected relationships that they have with people in the world that are going to mourn their loss or be adversely affected by their loss can contribute to how tragic their death is, right? And there's all sorts of other things that that factor into how someone's death affects the world, that I think we can plausibly say affects how tragic their death was. But deprivationism is not a view about how tragic death is for the world or from the perspective of the universe. Deprivationism is a view about the badness of death for the person who died. It's not a view about any of this other stuff. And once we get clear on what the view is about, then it's not so counterintuitive, I think, to say that the worst time for you to die is typically the moment you come into existence, because your death then would, in most cases, deprive you of more net good life than other cases. But that's not to say the most tragic time to die necessarily is the moment you come into existence. I leave that question open. But there's people like Ben Bradley who've given reasons to think that death of a teenager is, say, more tragic than the death of a fetus. I personally would much prefer to die now at 34 years old than as a fetus. Irrespective of how good or bad my death is for me, I would just, if I had two options, one of a very short amount of life that was, we can assume, on the whole good, and one of a much longer amount of life that is on the whole good, I will always take the option that involves, all else equal, a much greater amount of good life. So I don't see the counterintuitive implications once we draw this sort of distinction. And then there's no need to tack on the sort of bells and whistles to the deprivation account that Jeff McMahon does to try to account for these judgments that we have, most people supposedly have, that the death of a teenager is worse than the death of an infant or fetus.
So Travis, you have an essay in the book called "If You Want to Die Later, Then Why Don't You Want to Have Been Born Earlier?" Mark, did you want to discuss this one?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you down to do that, Travis?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
That's
so yeah,
this one that I know the best.
Yeah. So this is the one that it's like a criticism of Lucretius's symmetry argument, right?
Yeah.
Did you talk about this in the wireless philosophy video that you were part of?
Yeah, I did. So the solution that I give in the wireless philosophy video is the same thing that I say in the book, and then I give an even more worked out version of the solution in a paper that was published in Ratio in 2018. Um, but what I wanted to do for this book was kind of distill the solution to uh, make it accessible for people that have never read anything in the philosophy of death before, whereas the Ratio paper gets into the weeds a lot more. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go through the symmetry problem again and then review my solution to it.
Yeah. So if people aren't familiar with the argument from Lucretius, how would you if you could just summarize that and then go forward?
Yeah, so it's not quite clear what Lucretius thought. I think the historical version of Lucretius is a view about whether death is intrinsically bad. It's sort of anachronistic to use the term intrinsic badness with respect to what Lucretius thought, but I think that's the most charitable reconstruction of his view. But that's not what people in the contemporary literature about philosophy of death are talking about. Here's what they seem to have in mind. So this is the asymmetry problem that I mentioned earlier. Contemporary Epicureans will say, look, deprivationists say that death is bad for you insofar as it prevents you from living additional good life. But then don't they also have to think that the event that brought you into existence was bad for you because it prevented you from missing out on additional good life? Because if we could have died later and had more good life, then it seems like we could have been conceived earlier and had more good life, assuming that doing so doesn't affect the date that we die. Okay. So the sort of challenge is to either say what the relevant difference is between the two cases, such that an earlier than necessary death can be bad for you, but a later than necessary conception not be bad for you, or to accept that those two things should be on a par. Okay. So what like Lucretius perhaps did, and what contemporary kind of Epicureans do, is say these two things are on a par. It's not bad for you to have been born later than necessary. So it likewise is not bad for you to die earlier than is necessary. Most deprivationists want to say that these two events are not on a par, and most will go in for saying that your later than necessary conception is not bad for you in any way, but your earlier than necessary death is bad for you. And there's a variety of different reasons that they give to try to explain the difference between them. So one reason that goes back to Thomas Nagel in his seminal paper on death, just titled Death, that came out in Noose in 1969, 1970, says that while it's possible for us to die later than we do, right? Say I die in a car crash today. It's possible for me to die later than I did by not having been in the car crash in the first place. It's not possible for us to have been born substantially earlier in time. It's not possible for us to have been born substantially earlier. Why is that? Well, Thomas Nagel thought it wasn't possible because your identity depends on the zygote that turned into you. And that particular zygote could have only been created with one particular sperm and egg combination. So if one's parents didn't conceive at the exact time that they did, that brought about the exact sperm and egg combination that gave rise to the zygote, which gave rise to the fetus, which gave rise to the baby, which gave rise to the person in question, assuming identity is maintained through all of those events. That couldn't have happened substantially earlier in time. In fact, our existence is very modally fragile, and if anyone had conceived at slightly different times, they probably would have created different humans. And you know, my parents couldn't have created me unless they were created, and they couldn't have been created unless each of their parents conceived them at the exact time that they did, and then none of my grandparents could have existed unless their parents conceived them at the exact time that they did, and so on, back to the origin of parent-given life. And before that, the events of the world had to unfold in probably close to exactly the way that they did in order for anyone, in order for humans to evolve and then start reproducing.
Is this essentially like the non-identity problem?
It gives rise to the non-identity problem.
Okay.
That's right. So, but Nagel just thinks when we reflect on this means that none of us could have been born substantially earlier because the events of the world couldn't have unfolded in such a way that we were born substantially earlier. It's not like two different people could have had me 100 years before I was born because they couldn't have, the egg and sperm didn't exist to create the zygote that turned into me. So that's one reason to think that you couldn't be born substantially earlier in time. So like Nagel's view is it's not bad for you to not have been conceived earlier because you couldn't have been conceived earlier, but it is bad for you to not die later because you could not die at the time that you do and live much longer. Now you might think you might have a different account of identity that would allow you to be born substantially earlier in time, or you can imagine cases that Nagel didn't seem to have in mind that allows you to be born earlier. So suppose that we're imagining a human that was created, let's say, in vitro in 1990, but that sperm and egg had existed in a lab since 1980. So they could have been created 10 years earlier, even given like what Nagel is assuming about what's required for personal identity. They could have been created in 1980 rather than 1990. But you might think, look, if you're created 10 years earlier, even though it would be you, perhaps your identity would be maintained, whether you were created in 1980 or 1990, you would be a very different person than you in fact are. So this was like Rick Kaufman's great insight, and he's published a lot on this particular issue, and he contributed to the book. He has a nice paper about this in there. So, if I were born 10 years earlier than I was, I would have different musical tastes than I have, most likely. I'd have different tastes in art. I would have different tastes in fashion. I would have different friends than I in fact do. That might have taken me down a different path where I wouldn't have pursued philosophy. I might have done something else. I would have had different teachers. I would have been influenced by culture in different ways. Just like everything that's part of my identity in this loose sense would be very different from what it in fact is. Assuming that like I still had a sister at all, we would be 13 years apart rather than 3 years apart, and that would affect my relationship with her. Or maybe I wouldn't have a sister at all. Maybe I would have other siblings. I mean, if you were created substantially earlier in time, and the rest of the world had sort of unfolded in the way that it did in the actual world, that would influence us in all sorts of ways, such that we'd be very different than we in fact are. So Rick Kaufman refers to what constitutes our identity as like our thin personhood, and then what constitutes our identity with all of the like contingent facts about the way that we're raised and how that affects us as our thick personhood. And what Rick suggests is that we care about our thick selves getting additional good life, and death deprives us of additional good life for our thick selves. But being born earlier, even in cases in which that's possible, doesn't deprive us of additional good life because our thick selves couldn't exist substantially earlier, even if it was the same sperm and egg combination that created the exact same zygote earlier in time. Okay, so that's Rick Kaufman's solution. Call that the impossibility solution. It's very popular, maybe I think most widely accepted solution in the literature. I don't think. Oh, so let me go over one more solution before I go over mine. You might also think that what's going on here is that there's temporal bias at play, and Lucas Meyer discusses this in an Australasian Journal philosophy paper, where it's a psychological fact about humans that we tend to care greatly about pain and pleasures in the future, and not really care at all about pains and pleasures in the past. And then there's other types of biases. We care a lot more about pain in the immediate future rather than the distant future. I think there's a good evolutionary explanation for that. But you might think we don't care about missing out on additional good life before we're born, because more generally we don't care about things that we missed out on in the past, but we do care about things that happen to us in the future. So to illustrate that sort of abstract thought, consider a case that Derek Parfit gives in Reasons and Persons. Here's an amended version of it. Suppose you wake up in a hospital and a nurse comes in and says, "Oh, you're one of two patients, and I don't know which one you are. You either just had a surgery that was, let's say, 10 hours of just pure agony, just the most horrific pain you can imagine for 10 hours straight. It was so bad we had to give you a pill to induce amnesia for that period of time to prevent you from being traumatized for life." Or you're the patient that's just about to get that surgery, but we've gotten a lot better at it, so it'll only be, let's say, 2 hours of pure agony before the surgery's over, and then we'll give you a pill to induce amnesia for those 2 hours, so you won't remember the agony after it happens. Parfit noted rightly that most people would hope that they already had the 10 hours of surgery that were in the past that was over and done with. But it seems odd that they're wishing that they had the worst event happen to them, because presumably 10 hours of agony is worse than 2 hours. But the difference is the 10 hours is in the past for the person and the 2 hours is in the future. So you might think what's going on with this asymmetry problem is that people don't care about not being conceived much earlier in time, because if that was bad, that was something that happened in the past, and they don't care about that. They care about badness in the future. Okay. So I don't think temporal bias is rational. Megan Sullivan has a great book that just came out a couple years ago in 2018 by Oxford called Temporal Biases. Convinced me we should be temporally neutral, in spite of the fact that we have these sorts of temporally biased stances. And I accept Nagel's claim that I'm inclined towards accepting his claim about identity, but do think we can construct cases where your identity is maintained and you're born earlier, like the in vitro case, but people still have asymmetric attitudes about those. So then take what Rick Kaufman says, that we couldn't be born substantially earlier and have the same sort of thick self, have like me existing with all of like my interests and desires and stuff intact. And I don't think that is right. There can be cases, albeit ones in faraway possible worlds, where we are born substantially earlier in time and have longer life as a result. Okay, so maybe like I'd be very different if I were, say, created in vitro and born 10 years earlier than I in fact was. But what if the causal chain of the universe were such that the Milky Way was created, let's say, 10 years earlier than it actually was after the Big Bang? And everything that happened within the Milky Way galaxy unfolded exactly as it did in the actual world. It just happened 10 years earlier. And then finally, drawing from an example that Chris Belshaw gives, suppose that a comet outside the Milky Way is going to hit Earth and destroy all life on Earth. Now, if the Milky Way were created 10 years earlier, then everyone who was alive at the time that the comet destroyed the Earth presumably would have had more good life if the Milky Way had in fact been created 10 years earlier, and they had been born 10 years earlier. And they would have still had their same thick selves. So I say it is bad in that case for people not to have been born or created substantially earlier in time, because that's a case where if that event happened, they would have existed, had the same thick self, and had more good life. So I do think the event of coming into existence can be bad for you in the same way that the event of going out of existence can be bad for you. But I say the worlds in which you come into existence the nearest possible worlds where people don't come into existence at the time they do tends to be worlds where they don't exist at all, because most of us aren't created in vitro, and the world in which the Milky Way were created earlier is very far away from the actual world. There's many things that would have to be different in order for that to happen. It's metaphysically possible, but it's not. It's so far removed from our actual world that it's a very, very distant possibility. In the actual world, most of the nearest possible world where we didn't come into existence is one where we just weren't conceived at all, right? That's the smallest sort of change from the actual world, is where people's parents didn't conceive them, or they conceived at a slightly different time and they created a different person. So as a matter of fact, I don't think anyone's birth or conception was bad for them unless they have a life that's not worth living. In almost every case, it'll be good for them to have been conceived at the time they were, if they had a life worth living. But it's possible for them to have bad deaths. And then I say, even if it's possible to have the event of being conceived or coming into existence be bad for you, we should still have sorts of asymmetrical attitudes towards the event of death and towards the event of coming to existence. And that is a result of which sorts of facts are salient to us. So since we tend to think more about the future, the things that our death will deprive us of will be more salient to us. Because the choices that we make are going to affect the time that we die, but not the time that we come into existence. That's going to factor into our deliberation in ways that our conception won't. And that'll make us focus on the event of death and how that could be bad for us. And that's not only like a perfectly fine thing to do, but like a rational thing to do. I shouldn't constantly be thinking about my conception and whether that was bad for me. I should be thinking about being sufficiently risk averse to avoid dying prematurely. So the line that I take is different from Rick Kaufman's, because I think you can be born earlier and have the same thick self, so your coming into existence can be bad for you. But nevertheless, I do think we should care much more, in an important respect, about the badness of our deaths than the potential badness of our coming into existence. I'll stop there. I don't know if I feel like I've rambled about that for too long. I don't know if that even was clear enough to make sense to you two.
Well, we read it, so
So you read
it's going to make sense to
your audience, I should say.
I think it made sense. One thing that I don't know if you addressed this was the criticism of like the anchor of time as a point of reference to say that something was before or after if the universe was to be created into existence. Could you comment on that?
So one thing that Lucas Meyer says is that the kind of case that I came up with is one where you're not actually born earlier. It's just the universe started, you might think in some sense earlier, but then it's not true that any of us came into existence earlier. I mean, I deny that. I mean, I imagine the case that I imagine is not one where everything in the universe happens earlier, but just everything in the Milky Way galaxy happens earlier. And on any sort of, I think, standard understanding of time, that'll have started at the point of the Big Bang. So it'll be true that everyone was born earlier. But the I think the insight of Lucas Meyer's comment, and something which I fully accept, is that the sorts of cases that he and Rick Kaufman and I and other people consider is that people don't really care about the time that they were born or the time that they die. What they care about is having a life, in most cases, pretty similar to the life that they actually had, but with experientially posterior goods tacked on. Which is to say, they want sort of the life that they have more or less with the friends that they have and the kind of identity that they have, or something like the thick self that they have, with the experience of additional goods tacked on at the end. And they don't care whether those additional goods are a result of a later death or an earlier birth. They don't care about the time that it happens with respect to the beginning and end of the universe. They just care about having those experientially posterior goods tacked on. So I think that is tracking what most people care about. I think it's on my view, that's not what they should care about. My view is that they should care about having the most good life possible, even if that they prudentially should care about having the most good life possible, even if that results in a radically different thick self, even if that changes them drastically. And morally, they should want that, so long as it's going to enhance the total well-being in the universe. But that's a very, very contentious view that I don't argue for in this chapter or in the Wi-Fi video or the ratio paper. But yeah, that's the view, is that they prudentially should just want the most good life possible, even if they're very different as a result, and morally they should want the life that's going to result in what's best for the universe.
Did you have any questions about that, Daly?
About that essay?
Yeah.
No, I think you covered it.
Yeah, I didn't have any questions about the essay either. I think you covered it well. I highly recommend people read it.
Thanks.
Did you have any other questions, Daly, about the overall book, or?
Maybe just one final question. It's not actually directly, I guess, related to death, but a number of essays in the book, I think, at least seem to favor the hedonistic account of harms and benefits.
Yeah.
And I mean, this has a lot to do, I guess, with the subject matter, since Epicurus was a hedonist. But I just wanted to know, do you feel that more analytic philosophers today are sympathetic to hedonism than, say, 15, 20 years ago? Because, I think many of the arguments against the rival theories are, to me, quite compelling. So I wonder if you see any shift in sort of general acceptance of hedonism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. My rough estimate is that hedonism has increased in popularity in the last 15 to 20 years, but it's certainly far from settled. And I don't think, I'm not even sure if most people accept hedonism. If I had to guess, I would think most philosophers accept some pluralistic account of intrinsic goods and bads, and are going to accept some objective list theory of well-being with lots of seemingly ad hoc things on the list. In the book, you hit the nail on the head when you said a lot of people sort of assume hedonism, in part because they're engaging with Epicureans who are hedonists. So if the Epicurean says death can't be bad for you for these reasons, and they're working under the assumption of hedonism, and you want to show how death could be bad even under that assumption, you take that on, at least for the sake of argument, even if the author in question doesn't personally accept hedonism as the view. But another reason that some people assume or talk as if hedonism is true in the book is just for ease of exposition, because it's easy to give examples to explain how much net pleasure or pain there is, and it's harder to give examples where you postulate a bunch of different intrinsic goods. If you say, like, this person gets this much pleasure, and then they gain this sort of knowledge, and then it affects their friendship in this way, that kind of complicates the calculus for how much good life there is. And it's not needed to make the argument in question, because you could assume any sort of account of well-being that you want with any sort of intrinsic goods and bads that you want to posit, and then have some kind of valuation of how good their life was for them during that period. But philosophy is already complicated enough. It's already abstract. So if you can give a simpler example to make it easier to comprehend, without having to, without that example being essential for your argument, then that's just like a good thing to do dialectically. So a lot of authors just sort of talk as if hedonism is true for that reason. There's some hedonists who contributed to the book, but a lot of them are just taking this on as a simplifying assumption for ease of exposition. But yeah, in spite of that, I do think hedonism is more popular than it was 15, 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Did you have any other questions, Daly?
Well, I don't know how we're doing on time for Travis.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, if it's okay, there is one aspect of it, the death, that I don't think we discussed, and I don't know if we have time, but there is a question of, if death is bad or good for the one who dies, when is it bad or good for us? And so I wonder if we have the time, there are obviously different views on this, and maybe you can give us a sketch of the main views of when, if death is bad, when is it bad?
Yeah, sure. So this is an issue not only for deprivationists who tend to write about it, but for anyone who thinks death can be bad for the person that dies. It looks like they have to answer the question, when is it bad? And the thing that the Epicurean will push on is any answer to that question seems counterintuitive for one of two reasons. It's going to not plausibly generalize to other types of events that we think are harmful, or it's going to seem to involve some sort of like special pleading for death, to treat death differently than other harms. And the thought is, why should we do that? We should just have like a general account of when events are harmful and not engage in sort of like post hoc rationalization to accommodate our judgments about death being bad for us. Okay, so philosophers have defended every possible view that you could give. So some have said priorism is true, which is the view that your death is bad for you, at least at some of the times before it happens. If you accept a desire satisfactionist account of well-being rather than hedonism, so if you think what's good or bad for you is having your desire satisfied or thwarted, you might think that. But that seems weird. The worry is that doesn't plausibly generalize, because if I break my leg next week, let's say, seems bad for me next week when my leg is broken, not now. If you say, some people said concurrentism is true, that death is bad for you at the moment that it happens. But that might seem weird because we don't think that in other cases, events that are bad for you and the time that they're bad for you are always necessarily coextensive. So if I break my leg next week, presumably it's bad for me not only when I break my leg, but afterwards when I'm in pain and suffering as a result of the broken leg. And also, death is only bad for us at the moment that we die, and we die in an instant, right? The process of dying might be very bad, but death itself just happens like that when you cross over, so to speak. Then it doesn't seem like it could be very bad for us. Why should we be so concerned about death if it's only bad for us for a tiny little moment? It doesn't seem so scary. I could handle any sort of bad thing for an instant. The, I think, most popular view is subsequentism. It says death is bad for you at least for some of the times after you're dead. But that's supposed to seem weird because while it does sort of like fit the picture with what we want to say about most other types of harms, so it doesn't have a generalization problem, it does commit people to saying that death can be bad for them at a time that they don't exist. You might think it's totally bizarre or nonsensical to attribute properties such as like a well-being level to you at a time that you don't exist. Um, you know, there's there's not, like, to use an example that Jens Johansson gives in the book. I think I don't have a financial status once I'm dead. It's not like I have any dollar amount or even $0. I have no financial status. I might not have like capabilities once I'm dead. It's not like I'm capable or incapable of doing certain things. I just there's like no fact about what I can and can't do once I'm dead because I don't exist. You might likewise think there's no fact about how well off I am when I'm dead. It's not like I have 0 units of intrinsic goodness and 0 units of intrinsic badness with a well-being level of 0 at that moment. I just have no well-being level whatsoever. So that's what's supposed to be wrong with subsequentism. You might say death isn't bad for you at any time. This is view known as atemporalism. So it is bad for you, but its badness isn't located in time. And that's supposed to seem like special pleading for death because we tend to think, supposedly, other events are located in time. So if I break my leg and then I'm, let's say, in pain for a week and then I'm in a cast for, I don't know, let's say 6 weeks, and that the cast is an inconvenience for me and I'd be better off if I weren't in a cast. I tend to think my breaking my leg was bad for me for those 6 weeks. And then it stopped being bad for me. But if we accept the atemporalist position about death and try to generalize, then we can say there's no time that breaking my leg was bad for me. That seems weird. You could accept eternalism, which is the view that death is always bad for you. And that seems very weird too, because we tend to not say that about other events. First off, so there's that generalization problem. Like if I stub my toe as a 10-year-old, we don't think that it's bad for me now as a 34-year-old. I think it was bad for me for a short period of time when I was in pain from stubbing my toe, and then it stopped being bad after that. But it also seems weird to say that about everyone's death. I mean, most people, I think, intuitively don't want to say that Socrates' death is bad for him right now. Might say his death was bad for him, even though he was pretty old. Had he not drank the hemlock, he presumably would have been able to live more good life. But it's not bad for him now, a couple thousand years later. So eternalism seems almost too morose in that respect. And finally, you could accept indefinitism, say that death is bad for you and maybe bad for you at some times, but the border is going to be vague. You might think that runs into a generalization problem. I don't know, it depends on what your concept of vagueness is. But if some of those times are going to, I mean, those times are either going to have to include sometimes before you're dead or sometimes after you're dead. And then that's just going to inherit the problems of priorism or subsequentism or both. So that's the issue. There's different solutions that deprivationists give to that. So Neil Feit in the book argues that our death is bad for us at the times after we're dead, when had our actual death not occurred, we would have been alive and had a positive well-being level. And he gives a nifty little argument to try to suggest that deceased people do have well-being levels of 0, so we can attribute well-being properties to them at times if they don't exist. Other people, such as Duncan Purves, have argued elsewhere, not in our book, that the question about when death is bad for you should look at not well-being levels that you have once you're deceased, but on the amount of intrinsic good or bad that you accrue at various times. And people that have no well-being levels, by definition, get no intrinsic good or bad because they can't, because they don't exist. So Duncan Purves gives the same sort of subsequentist answer to the question that Neil Feit does, but he does so without assuming that deceased people have well-being levels. Okay. I'll just say quickly, I won't get into the weeds. I have a paper that's forthcoming in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy And I argue that the question, when is death bad for the person that dies, is too vague. And there might be at least four different questions that people could be asking when they say, when is your death bad for you? And all that we have to do is precisify the question. And then on each of the precise versions of the question, we can see that the deprivationist has a straightforward answer that doesn't assume any contentious metaphysical issues such as well-being, as deceased people having well-being levels, and it plausibly generalizes. So it would take like an hour to review all of those different interpretations and then the answers that we would give. But I'll just say I have a paper that's coming out about this. I hope it answers the question or helps solve the problem, but I don't know. We'll see how people react.
Cool. Looking forward to the paper.
Thank you.
Was there anything you would like to comment on or address that we may have missed before we wrap up?
No, I thought we were going to talk. I thought we were going to chat a little more about antinatalism. I don't want to.
Oh, really?
make us chat about antinatalism, but just since daily negativity was on, I was.
Well, do you have time to do a little chat about that, or?
I do, if you're both free for that and you want to chat about it.
Yeah, I have a podcast about it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I was curious to ask both of you is, like, I sort of know every antinatalist that I've encountered has just been someone in academia. It's been like Chris Belshaw or Thomas Nagel, but what I don't know as much about is the reception of antinatalists among non-academic philosophers. So like your audience that listens to the podcast, I take it there's academics among them, but I also take it as just antinatalism is in the zeitgeist, so to speak, and it's gotten a lot of attention in just like the culture at large. And I sort of wonder like how it's perceived out there, and if there's any sort of like differences between general trends between like what antinatalists who are not academic philosophers think and what antinatalists who are academic philosophers think, or if there's really like not a difference in their thought process. I don't know if you have a sense of that from your audience, or if you want to talk about that, but that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, so daily negativities, well, I don't want to speak on his behalf of his audience, but there are certain channels that talk about antinatalism that tend to be more philosophically inclined than a more activist type of commentary. And so, like, I think I attract a different subset of the community. So for example, I'm a co-host of the podcast now. So Amanda Oldfan Sukanik, she's been doing this for like 10 years, promoting this. Probably going on 11 years now. And I mean, there's a whole variety of people within the community where some people are more like of this environmental type of antinatalists, or they've kind of seeped in through the child-free movement. I do not run into a lot of academic antinatalists unless I search for it. What's your experience been like, Daly?
I think it's generally kind of, it's a mixed bag. People have, many different reasons that people hold this view. So I think I've kind of run into really, Mark, you mentioned, some people do it or take this view for environmental reasons. Some people just don't want children. But as in a way, those are separable, I think, from antinatalism, because antinatalism is really the view that it's morally wrong to create sentient beings. So, but as far as the, my audience, I think it really is the only thing that kind of brings them together is that they are all antinatalists. But besides that, there are many differences in terms of views about killing and views about ceasing to exist, and those are all things that, again, you can separate from the issue. But I think it's a pretty diverse audience, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. Do you have an idea about like roughly how many accept, like, say, Benatar's asymmetry between pain and pleasure?
There was a YouTuber who did a sort of informal poll, and I think they did this on Reddit as well for the anti-nihilism Reddit, but I forgot the results of that poll. Anecdotally, at least in my personal experience, a lot of people accept the consent argument and not necessarily the asymmetry argument. And there's a philosopher, Julio Cabrera, that makes his own argument, but also has critiqued Benatar. And that seems to be, I keep running into people who think that criticism, and I think goes in line with Christina Overall's argument. I need to refresh my mind on this stuff. It's convincing, and I still hold to the axiological asymmetry argument. I think it's still strong, but I don't think that's the most popular one. That's my own opinion. What do you think, Daly?
Yeah, I think I've got the same impression. A lot of people don't seem to accept the asymmetry. I mean, antinatalists. Many antinatalists actually just flat out reject that argument. So it might be because I think actually Benatar's argument for the asymmetry makes it much more plausible. I mean, I think when you just hear the asymmetry argument stated, it might seem kind of implausible, but in fact, it does seem to explain many of our other common intuitions. And I think that's the point that, when you simply hear the point, the conclusion, it seems a bit odd, and I can see why people would be inclined to reject it. But I think when you actually look at Benatar's arguments for that position, I mean, it's actually similar to, I think it's similar, Benatar's argument for saying that, death per se, annihilation can be bad. At first I thought that's a rather odd view. I found that kind of implausible. But actually, I recently was reading Benatar's The Human Predicament, and I think those arguments are actually quite. I don't know if I'm totally convinced, but they have force, I think. So I think many people are not actually, maybe they just aren't aware of the reasons that Benatar gives for those positions. And, that's very important, of course, in philosophy, because many views seem very strange and, implausible when you just see them. But often the reasons given, do make them much more plausible. But in general, I think, it's not a popular view, I don't think, among antinatalists, at least, that you find on YouTube or I wouldn't say it's up there in terms of like, I think, Mark mentioned the consent arguments about consent and maybe risk. I think those arguments are, they're very easy to understand too. And I think they do have force. So those arguments, I think, are more popular, and you see them more often in the community.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I thought that might be the case, but I didn't, that was just wild speculation on my part. And I think, Mark, you sort of alluded to this earlier, that Benatar's annihilation view, which is going to entail that death is intrinsically bad for the person who dies, sounds like that. I mean, I don't know if that's a view that's widely accepted amongst non-academic antinatalists. You seem to sort of suggest that, like, it probably wasn't. Did I hear that right, or am I misremembering?
That was Daly who mentioned that.
Oh, Daly, sorry. Yeah, is that your impression then, Daly, that like most people in the antinatalist community don't think that death is intrinsically bad for the person that dies once you do exist?
Yeah. Well, I think this is another issue that antinatalists are divided on. I mean, I imagine some antinatalists would simply, would say that death, would take the Epicurean view that, death is neither good nor bad.
Mhm.
I think a lot of antinatalists actually would say that death is bad, and may even take Benatar's view that death per se is bad, that because it annihilates the individual. And actually, there's a reason for that. I mean, one reason, which may be a bit cynical, but like it does support antinatalism, right? I mean, if death is bad, that's another reason. That's at least a reason why it would be bad to come into existence. Now, all things considered, it might be okay, but if death is an evil, then I mean, it's interesting in a way, because I think Benatar says this, that we have to be careful when we talk about optimism and pessimism, because it might seem that, if you say that death is good, this is a view that uh, I'm inclined to accept, that death, on a pessimistic view, maybe death is good for the one who dies. But that view, which might seem pessimistic, in a way is optimistic, right? About death. It's an optimistic view about our predicament. And Benatar's pessimism is actually more pessimistic, because Benatar thinks that, life is bad, but so is death. And that's a very pessimistic view about our predicament. So
Yeah.
I think some people might just be, they want death to be bad. Actually, they want it to be the case that death is bad and that life is bad, because that does seem, at least it seems to me, that would even strengthen the case for antinatalism. Again, it might not be, that it might not be enough, but I think it supports the view.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Right. So if death is, I think if death is intrinsically bad, then it would provide another reason against uh, creating people, because you're subjecting them to at least something that's intrinsically bad. I think the intrinsic goods can outweigh the intrinsic bads, but I take your point that that would be a reason against it. If it's merely extrinsically bad, the annihilation view is false and some kind of simple deprivationism. Uh, that holds true. If it's merely extrinsically bad, then I don't know if that actually even counts as a reason against it, because I don't think we should care about lots of extrinsic bads, but that's just my own weird view. And then I take your point about pessimism as well, right? So if death is good for you, since we're all going to die, that would be sort of welcome news. I mean, a lot of people find just Epicureanism uh, comforting. If it turns out that death isn't bad for you, then the thought is like we have one less thing to fear, one less thing to worry about. So if it's not good or bad for you, that might be help reduce anxiety. But if it's good for you, then that's even better than being neutral. Right. And Benatar's view is in one way, most pessimistic of all. Not pessimistic in the Schopenhauer sense, but like in the sense of it being very sad about the predicament we'd be in if he's right. It was terrible for us to come into existence, and now that we exist, we have some kind of interest in continued life that we're going to lose and be annihilated, and then that would also be bad for us. So it's just bad all around on Benatar's view.
Yeah, yes, it's one of the most pessimistic philosophies that I've come.
Yeah, yeah. We're doing in my philosophy of death class. We're doing the exploring the philosophy of death and dying, and then Benatar's the human predicament. I always pick like an extra book and make my students do presentations on it. So like one year was John Martin Fisher's and Ben Mitchell Young's book on near-death experiences. One year was Ben Bradley's book, Wellbeing in Death. A couple of times I've done the human predicament now, and students they're really engaged with it though. They really,
Nice.
I was going to say love the book, but that might be give the wrong connotation. They're really engrossed by the book and really interested in it.
I used to be comforted by the Epicurean view. And when I read Benatar's work, it didn't take away that comfort. It sort of solidified all these other views that I had. So even though he's more pessimistic, I'm oddly more comfortable accepting the Annihilation account. Speaking of which, is the Annihilation account in the book?
No, it's not. It's not in our book.
Oh, okay.
Benatar wrote a great chapter for us on the rational and moral permissibility of suicide. But we didn't have anyone talk about annihilation being intrinsically bad. Maybe if we get a second edition, it'd be nice to have Frances Cam contribute and talk about her Limbo Man thought experiment, where she thinks we should say annihilation is intrinsically bad because we can imagine someone who is choosing between two possible lives, one that contains a longer period than the other, but each containing the same net amount of good. And she thinks it's rational as like a tiebreaker to live the longer life that avoids or delays the annihilation, even if it's stipulated that you don't get any other intrinsic goods in those cases. I'm not convinced by that thought experiment, but I do think she captures something that is very intuitive for a lot of people. I am working on a book on the philosophy of death, just a monograph, not an edited book, and one chapter will be dedicated to the annihilation view. So
Nice.
it's not in the Exploring Philosophy of Death and Dying, but it will be at some point in a book.
Awesome. Cool. I was curious, how come historically, when it comes to deprivationism, the only person that I can think of originally was Nagel. Was there someone before that talked about this or made the argument for it?
That's a good question. I'm sure that this was a view that a lot of people held, even if they haven't thought of it in those terms prior to Nagel. But as far as I can tell, in the philosophical literature, Nagel was the first one to articulate deprivationism with that 1969 newspaper.
How come he was excluded from the book?
Oh, he wasn't excluded from the book. There's lots of people who we would have liked to contribute that were too busy or had better things to do than to write a chapter.
Oh, sorry. I mean, like in terms of like classical readings, like why wasn't his original paper?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, we originally wanted to just reprint that death one.
Yeah.
But we ended up getting a contract that said there were no permission fees that were paid, and New still owns the license to death, so Routledge would have had to pay a lot of money to have that news article in there.
Right. Yeah.
So even though we originally wanted it, the budget that we had just didn't allow for those sorts of permission fees, because it would have made the production cost so high. But, and this isn't just me saying this, I think in retrospect, it was better that we didn't include that, because even though that is just an absolutely incredible paper that sort of set off the modern deprivationist literature, and Nagel is a phenomenal writer, so it's totally clear and like undergraduates can understand it. The deprivationist view today, as formulated commonly, is very different than that. Yeah, so I think it worked out to have other people sort of articulate the contemporary view and cite the Nagel rather than just making students read the classic text, because we've made a lot of progress in the last 50 years.
True. Yeah.
Well, I say we, but like the other philosophers have made lots of progress in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Are you involved in the Death Conference coming up?
Yeah, I am supposed to present a paper there. I wasn't on the committee looking at abstracts or anything this year, but I go to it every year, whether or not I'm presenting. Like I went the last 2 times, even though I wasn't presenting. And then this year I'm supposed to present a paper critiquing David Benatar's Annihilation view. I'm assuming that it still happens, but with COVID travel restrictions, I don't know whether it's going to be remote or in person or rescheduled or what. I'm not involved in and those decisions for this iteration of the conference.
Okay. Did either of you have any other things you want to address?
No, I think just to thank you for your time.
No, thank you both for having me on. It was an absolute pleasure to chat with you, and I'm honored that you wanted to give me the chance to talk about the book too.
I'm honored to have you on the channel. It's been a pleasure. Saturday morning discussions about death.
Yeah,
I highly recommend people pick up the book. It's available on Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description, and I'll also leave a link to the organization about death. I forgot the whole name of it. What is it?
yeah, the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying. It's a real mouthful.
Yeah, but you guys are on Twitter, and so whenever new stuff comes out, it's good to follow. So I'll leave a link to that as well. Yeah, so again, thanks for coming on. And also, Daly, thank you for being part of this conversation. I appreciate you coming on. And yeah, have a great day.
Yeah, thank you both. It was a real pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks.